In this week's lecture, we're going to cover a totally new approach to personality, B.F. Skinner's behavioral approach. The B and F in B.F. Skinner stand for Burrhus Frederick. He was an American psychologist who was well known for promoting the behavioral approach. It was one of the three forces in psychology: psychoanalysis, behavioral approach, humanistic approach. He specifically studied voluntary behavior and the impact of what comes after the behavior, how the consequences of behavior impact future behavior. His behavioral approach, and behaviorism in general, was very different from the other personality theories that had been proposed at the time. Skinner was born in 1905 in Pennsylvania to hardworking parents. From an early age, they used rewards and discipline to shape his behavior. They had high expectations for what proper behavior meant, and they expected Burrhus, to follow their rules. He was very interested in machines. He spent hours upon hours building these little contraptions that he would then use to terrorize his neighbors. He flung potatoes into their yards. He was also interested in animals, observing their behavior, trying to teach them how to do tricks. From an early age, he was an independent thinker and had goals of becoming a writer. But in young adulthood, when he set aside time to write, hopefully a book, something he could publish, when he set time aside to try to fulfill this dream, he failed. He couldn't get his ideas on paper. He didn't produce anything worth publishing. He considered this to be a failure, suffered an identity crisis, and eventually would change career paths because of it. After reading about E.L. Thorndike and John Watson, Skinner became interested in psychology, specifically the behavioral approach, probably because it is a more mechanistic, more machine-like approach based on animal studies. Two of Skinner's favorite things: machines and animals. He decided to go to graduate school at Harvard University and earned his PhD in psychology in 1931. He stayed there until 1936. Then he taught at the University of Minnesota, Indiana University, and returned to Harvard about 10 years later in 1948 and stayed there until he retired in 1974. Throughout his life, he published 21 books, 180 articles, and invented procedures as well as equipment, for instance, the Skinner box. Skinner is one of the most popular psychologists in the field's history. In 2002, the APA named him the most influential psychologist of the 20th century. Skinner's theory was very different from the other theories we've covered so far, so let's start by going over some of those differences. First, his theory, his ideas about personality are based on his research with animals, specifically rats and pigeons. He studied some other small animals too. He did admit that animal behavior and human behavior are not identical. He recognized that, but he believed that the differences are in the degree to which animals do something and humans do something, not in the nature of how they behave. So he was basically saying that although humans and animals don't behave exactly the same way, the fundamentals are the same, therefore we can use animal studies to understand human behavior. He believed that personality was shaped by nurture, not by nature. He did not consider biological factors. He believed that we learn to behave the way that we behave through reinforcement and punishment, specifically in childhood. But although we learn these things in childhood, we can still change as adults as we are rewarded and punished with our friends, at school, at work. Here's another way in which Skinner was very different from the other theorists. Some of them suggested humans have free will when it comes to personality development, that some of our qualities and our behaviors are choices, are things that we choose to do. They're not dictated by genes or childhood experiences. We are in control of those behaviors. Skinner believed that this free will was really just an illusion. He believed all behaviors are conditioned. Everything we do, according to Skinner, is because we've been rewarded and punished for it at some point in time. Following this logic, he said behaviors can be changed, modified, controlled, predicted by changing the consequences. He created this procedure that he called operant conditioning to attempt to change behavior by changing rewards and punishments. By saying that all behaviors are conditioned, and by saying that these behaviors can be changed and even predicted by examining the consequences, he attempted to explain human behavior, human personality in very machine-like terms. Machines are orderly, they are predictable, they follow a specific set of laws. And while humans do to some degree follow principles of human behavior, you know as well as I do, we cannot predict human behavior with 100% accuracy like we could with a machine. But Skinner truly believed that voluntary behavior, not reflexes, but voluntary behavior can be conditioned. He didn't completely discount free will. He did believe that humans have some control over the environment they find themselves in. They can do different things to the environment, to the context, to change the outcomes, to change consequences. But for the most part, humans are controlled by the things they were reinforced and punished for in childhood and adulthood. Skinner tried to explain all behavior, not just personality. We will look at his ideas about personality after we look at his broader ideas about general behavior. He urged psychologists to only study behavior, to only study those things that they can observe. So for instance, you can't observe my happiness, right? You cannot see happiness. Happiness is an abstract idea. Skinner believed that although happiness exists, using a survey to measure it doesn't work. He believed we had to focus on behaviors, things like smiles and laughing and using one's hands instead of having your arms crossed. He urged psychologists to focus only on those things that they could observe with their own eyeballs. From a scientific standpoint, he said humans are empty organisms. There's nothing inside us, no unconscious forces, no childhood experiences, no genes, no striving for self-actualization. None of these things inside of us matter when it comes to understanding behavior and personality. That's because these things can't be measured objectively by science, according to him. It wasn't that he was saying these things don't exist. He was just saying that because we can't observe it, because we can't put our finger on it, we can't use it to try to explain the human. Science must be observable, and therefore we should only study behaviors. Skinner distinguished between two types of behavior, respondent and operant. Respondent behavior includes our responses to things in our environment. These behaviors are essentially reflexes. For instance, our pupils constrict in response to bright lights. We jump in response to loud noises. Our heart beats faster when we see an animal that we're afraid of. For me, it's snakes. For some of you, it might be spiders. For others, it might be a grizzly bear. All of these behaviors are respondent behaviors. They are involuntary reflexes that occur in response to something in the environment, some stimulus in the environment. Skinner believed these behaviors are less important because they can't account for all of our behaviors, and they certainly can't account for personality. Personality doesn't have much to do with the heart beating and the pupils constricting. All of the other behaviors are called operant behaviors. These are the voluntary behaviors that we see every day. Things like picking up a phone to send a text message, getting on the computer to do your homework, driving down the road. These complex behaviors are based on operant conditioning. We learn how to do these behaviors through reinforcements and punishments. Operant behavior is said to operate on the environment, meaning change it. Skinner believed that not only do consequences impact behavior, but behavior can then impact the environment in which reinforcements, punishment occur. When Skinner worked with animals, he would often deprive them of food before working with them. This motivated them and got them good and ready to do what he wanted them to do. When he would put food-deprived rats into his Skinner box, the rats would begin by walking around, sniffing everything, exploring. These are examples of operant behaviors. The rat is sort of choosing to do these things. Eventually, he would teach the rat how to press a lever in the box. That behavior, press a lever, would result in a food pellet. In that way, that operant behavior of pushing the food lever changes the environment. Now there's a food pellet. The environment is different because of the behavior. Therefore, that behavior operates on the environment. Initially, Skinner relied on these three processes to train his animals: positive reinforcement, extinction, and punishment. And really, in the beginning, it was all about positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is the act of strengthening a behavior, a response, by adding something that the organism wants after the behavior. Positive reinforcement gives something the creature wants after the behavior to increase the likelihood that that behavior happens again. With his rats and pigeons, food was often the positive reinforcer. Extinction is the process of removing a behavior or reducing the likelihood that it is repeated by ignoring it, by withholding positive reinforcement. We don't punish, we don't reinforce, we let the behavior be and hope that the animal won't repeat it. Punishment is the act of weakening a response, of making it less likely that that behavior happens again in the future. Punishment occurs after the behavior. It's something undesirable. It's something that the organism doesn't like. The addition of something unwanted weakens the connection between the stimulus and the response, between the light and the pressing of the lever. To make sure that every animal had the same experience, Skinner created the operant chamber. Clark Hull, another popular psychologist at the time, named it the Skinner box. So most of us know it by that name, but it was originally called the operant chamber. It had lights, a speaker, a food dispenser, sometimes a water dispenser, a lever that the animals were trained to push, and later on an electrified floor grid. The animals were deprived of food in order to motivate them and placed in these boxes in isolation by themselves. He recorded the rate of their responses using a cumulative recorder. He did have records of how many times the animal pushed the lever, how long it took them to respond between the moment the light or the sound appeared and they exhibited the behavior he was wanting them to. After the rats explored the inside of the Skinner box, he began to reinforce certain behaviors and extinguish or punish other behaviors. When the rat would get close to the bar, he would reinforce that behavior. When they would look at the bar, when they would touch the bar, when they would step toward the bar, he would reward those behaviors with a food pellet. when the rat faced the wrong direction, when the rat didn't look at the lever, when the rat went to the opposite side of the box, that behavior was not reinforced, and in some cases it was punished with electric shocks. Over time, the rats learned to press the lever in order to get food. And once they learned that, they would repeatedly press the lever to try to get food. Every time they pressed the lever, they would get a reward. But Skinner recognized that in real life, humans are not reinforced after every behavior. There are certain behaviors that only get reinforced every once in a while. So he studied different schedules of reinforcement in his animals, his rats, his pigeons. Interval schedules have to do with the amount of time that passes between the behavior and the application of the reinforcer. The ratio schedules have to do with the number of behaviors that have been exhibited. In the fixed column, the number of behaviors and that time interval is a fixed number, a predetermined number. In the variable column, that number varies. The number of behaviors required to get the reward and the number of minutes, hours that must pass before the reward is applied. Both of those numbers vary. When we use the fixed interval schedule, we apply the reinforcer after a fixed amount of time has elapsed. If you are paid a salary every 2 weeks, this would be an example of a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement. You're not paid based on the number of hours you work. You're not paid based on the number of sales you make. You're based on the amount of time that has elapsed, 14 days. A variable interval schedule presents the reinforcer after an unknown amount of time. The amount of time that passes between the behavior and the consequence varies. It might be 2 hours, it might be 1 hour, 40 minutes, the next time it might be 3 hours. When you go fishing, you never know when you're going to be rewarded with a fish. You never know when you're going to catch the next fish. You might catch several in the first hour and then not catch another one for 5 hours. You might not catch any fish all day. This is an example of a variable interval schedule being rewarded at various times. A fixed ratio schedule applies the reinforcer after a certain number of behaviors have been exhibited. A piece rate pay system uses this type of schedule. After employees make a certain number of products, they receive their pay. They're paid based on what they produce, how many items they produce, how many services they provide. Using a variable ratio schedule, the reinforcer is presented after an unknown number of behaviors. It could be that 10 behaviors are required on the first trial, and then it's 12 behaviors the next trial, and then it's 8 behaviors the next. Slot machines rely on this type of schedule. When you sit down to play a slot machine, you don't know how many times you're going to have to pull that lever before you win. It could be several hundred times. You could put in a lot of money before you are reinforced, but eventually you will be reinforced if you pull the lever enough times. Skinner drew a number of conclusions based on his research using different schedules of reinforcement. I've highlighted 2 here. 1, shorter time intervals usually result in higher response rates. The rats were more likely to do what he wanted them to do when he reinforced their behaviors within seconds. If he waited 10, 15, 20 seconds, he noticed that that wasn't quite as good at reinforcing as it was when there were only a few seconds between the behavior and the consequence, the reinforcer. 2, the variable ratio schedule seemed to be the best way to bring about not only high response rates, but to make sure that those response rates are stable across time. By not rewarding every behavior, the organism learns to just do the behavior because they never know when they're going to get that reward. It may be this time, it may be next time, but you better just do it because you might get rewarded. Skinner defined personality as a collection of behavior patterns, and these behaviors emerge in childhood. From infancy on, we display a number of different behaviors. Some of these behaviors are reinforced and behavior patterns emerge. The collection of patterns is what makes up personality. He did not describe anxiety, childhood trauma, or unconscious forces. He focused his definition on behaviors. When parents reinforce behaviors, it strengthens the likelihood that those behaviors happen again. For instance, at the grocery store, when a child throws a temper tantrum because they can't have a candy bar. When the parent buys the candy bar after the temper tantrum, the parent is reinforcing that temper tantrum. The candy bar serves as a reinforcer, increases the likelihood that that child will continue to throw fits, especially in that situation when they want a candy bar in that grocery store. When parents ignore, disapprove of, or punish behavior, it makes it less likely that that behavior will be repeated in the future. In the grocery store, while the child is throwing a fit, if the parent ignores the fit, according to Skinner, that will reduce the likelihood by ignoring it that it will happen again. Sure, in the moment it's embarrassing, but the next time the child throws a fit, you have to ignore it again or disapprove or punish it in some way. By giving in and giving the child what the child wants, you essentially reinforce that behavior that you were trying to stop in the first place. Skinner believed that while punishment can prevent undesirable behaviors from happening, or at least decrease the likelihood that they happen again, punishment is not suitable for changing an undesirable behavior into a desirable one. In other words, he identified early on that punishment has no place in reinforcing behavior. It doesn't work. It doesn't help make the behavior a bad, it doesn't help take a, it can't be used to take an undesirable behavior and make it into a desirable behavior. That's obvious to us today, but this was something that Skinner realized with his animal studies. I think we can all agree that a rat pushing a lever is a relatively simple behavior. Our personality is based on more complex behaviors. Skinner said that these complex behaviors can be conditioned through what he called successive approximation or shaping. Over time, he would reward only those behaviors that got closer to the end result. So at first, he would reward the rat when it just walked by the lever. He would stop doing that and only reinforce the rat when it touched the lever in some way. After a while, he would quit reinforcing that behavior and only reinforce pressure put on the lever. Maybe the rat didn't push it all the way down, but just putting pressure on the lever resulted in a food pellet. Successive approximation, rewarding behaviors as they get closer to the desired behavior. And I'll show you an example on the next slide. Learning how to speak is an example of a human behavior that is learned through successive approximation. At first, parents reward babbling. Parents smile and talk back and make funny little faces and funny little voices. Those are all reinforcers, and they increase the likelihood that that infant will continue to make those babbling sounds. As infants' brains develop and as they are exposed to more speech, they learn how to make the sounds for themselves. At age 1, parents no longer reinforce babbling, they reinforce sounds. Ch, k, ks, k. When children are 2 years old, parents no longer reinforce the babbling, they reinforce sounds, words, sentences. The idea is to reward at one stage until the organism has mastered that stage, then move on to the next stage, rewarding only behaviors within that stage, not necessarily previous behaviors. You can still reward them every once in a while, but the organism has already mastered that first level, so the focus becomes on getting the organism closer to the end goal. Here's an example of how we might use shaping to teach a puppy how to sit and stay on command. So in the first row, we have the behavior that we'd like to modify, that we'd like to change. Puppies tend to run around aimlessly, sniffing, searching, exploring their world. We want this puppy to be able to sit and stay when we tell it to. The first step might be to reward the puppy when he stands next to me. He'll explore the yard, come stand next to me, I'll give him a treat. We'll do that for a few days. The next step would be to only reward the puppy when he comes and stands next to me and stays for a few seconds. That may go on for a few days. The third step is to reward the puppy when he comes over to me, stays for a few seconds, and sits. Many dogs will do this naturally. They get tired, they want to take a break, they sit down. You have to watch for that puppy to sit down. The minute the puppy sits down, you reward with food, with praise. In that moment, the puppy realizes, okay, if I come over here, I stand, I chill out for a second, and I sit down, I get treats, affection, and this person who I adore seems to really be happy about it. Maybe I should try that again. Eventually, we have to introduce words. We have to pair the word sit, the word stay, with the action that we're expecting. So the puppy may come and sit down next to me, and I say the word sit. For a while, the word sit will come after the behavior, when the reward is presented. Eventually, when you say the word sit, because the puppy has associated the word sit, a reward, and a behavior all in one group, the puppy knows to do the action. The puppy recognizes that that word means do this, which means I get something yummy. Skinner also recognized that sometimes we are accidentally reinforced, and sometimes our behaviors are not rational. Some of the athletes in the class may have a lucky pair of socks that they wore during a championship game. They wore the socks, were rewarded with a win, and continue to wear the socks because in the mind, it's hard to break that connection. The game means a lot to you, high stakes situation, so you continue to wear the socks because you were reinforced the last time you wore the socks. Skinner said that behavior is controlled by the environment, but he also said that we do have some control in terms of the environment we find ourselves in. We can design our environment in an effort to change the types of rewards and punishments we receive from the environment. I have 5 of his strategies here on the screen. We can monitor our behavior. We might keep track of how many times we do something, or just pay more attention to our response. We can change the environment. We can avoid certain people, certain events, certain stimuli. We can redirect our attention. We can distract ourselves, pay attention to something else. We can also reinforce and punish ourselves. We can say good things to ourselves. We can say bad things to ourselves. And finally, we can inform other people about our goals for behavior change. This is interesting. By sharing your goals with other people, they can then change how they respond to you. For example, if your friends know that you're trying to minimize the amount of time you spend on social media, it would help if they didn't talk about the things they see on social media. If they start talking about a funny video they saw on TikTok, it's going to make you want to get on TikTok and watch the video. By telling your friends, hey, I'm trying to take a break from TikTok right now, they can then change your environment. They can change the way they interact with you to help you reach that goal. Negative reinforcement is the act of strengthening a behavior by removing an aversive stimulus from the environment. It's not the same thing as punishment. Negative reinforcement is a good thing. It's reinforcement. It increases the likelihood that a desirable behavior will happen again. The negative stands for removal of something bad. The positive in positive reinforcement has to do with the adding of something that somebody wants, the adding of something good. Course evaluations operate on this principle. You get email reminders until you complete the survey. These email reminders are negative reinforcers. They only stop, they only go away when you do what the university wants you to do, which is complete the evaluation. When we remove the email reminder, it serves as a reinforcer. You learn after a few semesters that you might as well just click on it and get it done with, or you will receive more emails. Same thing with resetting our passwords. You will get several email reminders. If you change it, after the first reminder, you won't receive any more reminders. That encourages you to change it the first time you get the reminder instead of waiting until the last minute and then forgetting to do it, like so many of us do. Skinner did not use free association, dream analysis, or projective tests. He used what we call functional analysis. He looked at the frequency of a behavior, the situation in which that behavior occurs, and the reinforcements, the consequences of that behavior in that environment. He analyzed the function of a behavior within a specific context. He preferred the case study method. He preferred to learn as much as he could about a single person in order to better understand why it is they behave the way that they do. In order to assess behavior, he used direct observation, self-report questionnaires, and even physiological measures. He looked at things like heart rate, and today we look at muscle tension, brain waves, sweat response, all kinds of things. The goal of behaviorism was to use psychology to change and modify behavior. Skinner was not the only one who was trying to do this. Based on his operant conditioning principles and his studies with rats and pigeons, Skinner invented several different products. I have two examples here. On the left, you see what is called a teaching machine. It's an early version of computer adaptive learning. It was used in the early days to help children learn how to do simple math and how to read. On the right, you see his air crib. It's a tightly controlled box for toddlers. The temperature is controlled. The idea is that the child cannot get into any trouble if it's in a box. Skinner's operant conditioning principles also inspired a new type of therapy. It's called behavior modification. The goal with this type of therapy is to use reinforcement to change behavior. The process is started by assessing the individual's behaviors. The goal is to change behaviors, so we usually pick out behaviors that are undesirable or that don't serve a purpose or that hurt the individual. We then decide how often reinforcers should be presented. We come up with the optimal schedule of reinforcement. Behavior modification is considered a type of therapy, but we use it in a variety of different situations. We use it in schools, we use it in businesses, we use it in the military, we use it in law enforcement, we use it in prisons, we use it in all types of organizations to change behavior. Skinner's work also inspired the creation of the token economy, where we provide tokens for desirable behaviors. Those tokens can then be exchanged for rewards. The token is the immediate reward. The thing you buy with the tokens is the long-term reward. This was used in the early days in institutions where patients were provided tokens for doing things like taking their medicine, getting up on time, making their bed, brushing their teeth. Simple behaviors like that could be reinforced with these tokens, and then the individuals could get things that they really wanted using those tokens. Token economies can be successful if used correctly and if used with the correct audience. You can do this with children to encourage the kinds of behaviors that you want. Potty training is often done using a version of the token economy. Unfortunately, once the tokens disappear, the behavior can be extinguished, can disappear. Despite the fact that behaviorism is so different from the other personality theories we've studied in this class, there is quite a bit of research support behind it. When it comes to trying to teach your dog how to do something, use treats, touch, and tone, the 3 T's, to try to encourage that behavior. There are 3 reinforcers present that increases the likelihood, of course, that the animal will do that behavior again, but it also provides this buffer against extinction. There is evidence that operant conditioning, the use of reinforcement and punishment to shape behavior, there is evidence that this does work to modify behaviors. We can't control people with operant conditioning, but we can teach people how to do things. We can modify behaviors. There is some evidence that those who are high in self-control enjoy positive outcomes more so than those who are low in self-control. One study of college students found that the ones who scored higher on the self-control measure had better grades, were psychologically better adjusted, and had higher self-esteem. Token economies can work, and there are plenty of studies to provide evidence for this. One study found that in an institution, acts of aggression were reduced up to 80% using these small reinforcements. 80% reduction in aggressive behavior. One study, but in that organization, that was a big deal. Now let's talk about the strengths of Skinner's theory before we look at some of the weaknesses. Its number one strength was that it was incredibly influential. Because it was incredibly influential, lots of people tried to replicate and disprove his theory, but only provided more evidence to support his principles. He focused on observable behavior, which is harder to fake. Many of the personality tests that we've talked about in this class can be faked. When it comes to behavior, it's a little bit more difficult to fake a behavior. You either see it or you don't. There's plenty of modern research support for his theory, more so than the other theories. Part of this has to do with his focus on measurable behaviors. His theory continues to be popular today and applied in a variety of different situations. If you've ever trained one of your pets to do a trick, you've used operant conditioning principles. Finally, let's cover some of the weaknesses of Skinner's theory. Although he focused on measurable behaviors, he completely disregarded all of the other factors that might be playing a role. He ignored the unconscious, childhood experiences, unless they had to do with reinforcement and punishment. He ignored free will. Many of the factors that the other theorists had pointed out, he completely disregarded, and those theories came first. The final weakness I'd like to bring up is how he ignored animals' tendency to sometimes respond reflexively, instinctively. It's called instinctive drift, and it was identified after Skinner published his original studies. Some of his students noticed that the animals they were trying to train would periodically revert back to instinctive behaviors. They might try to teach a bear how to balance a ball on its nose, but every once in a while that bear would respond with aggression. That's the bear's natural response. They weren't able to completely condition some of these behaviors out of the animals. Sometimes the animals would act like animals. That's it for the week 7 lecture. As we approach the end of the semester, we'll start to slow down a little bit in terms of the number of chapters we read, the number of slides we cover, the amount of information that we cover. If you have any questions, as always, let me know, and I will see you next week when we talk about the final theory in personality, Albert Bandura's social learning theory.